Hello and welcome to Against the Law, the myth-busting ancient history podcast. We're bringing you something a bit different today. We've got an exciting special guest with us. Dr Jeremy Swist is a classicist and heavy metal enthusiast, and he sat down with us last week to tell us about how ancient history features in heavy metal music. And it turns out there's a lot more than you might think.
So, Jeremy, what are the themes from the ancient world that you can identify in modern music?
The important thing about modern reception of antiquity in modern music, popular music, is that itself is a part of general popular culture reception. So it's going to take a lot of cues from especially things like film and TV and, say, popular documentaries. The ancient world is often filtered through the lens of things like Hollywood and films like Gladiator and 300 and HBO's Rome, and etc. And that is what often is the basis of inspiration for a lot of musical artists in various genres writing songs on this stuff. And so the themes that you see prevalent in other forms of popular reception are also going to be in these various musical genres. So for instance, in heavy metal, there is often focus on war, battles, great generals, but also tyrants and warlords, individuals who have a lot of power and strength, the kind of extremes of human passion and cruelty, and also go on fantastic adventures and explore, and they conquer. So figures such as Odysseus and Julius Caesar and Nero and Caligula and Achilles are often popular topics, as well as the 300 Spartans and Alexander the Great, perhaps most of all. Okay, so those sorts of figures that you see from Hollywood, heavy metal resonates with that quite a bit. There's a lot of mythology, and particularly mythology that has to do with with romance. For instance, the myth of Orpheus is, you see that in various places. Also, the myth of Icarus you see in certainly a lot of heavy metal, but also rock music and various other topics. So, for instance, recently, Lil Nas X did, song that had that quotation from Plato's Symposium about the origin of love. I would say, love poetry and mythology having to do with erotic themes. Certainly, we see that a lot. But also, when you get to more the extreme music, then we see, again, war, violence, brutality, the darker side of human nature, the decadence of, these kind of Hollywood pictures of Rome. Transition well into heavy metal.
It sounds like you're saying it's almost sort of two extremes. You've got the war and death side, but then sort of romance and eroticism. It's like it's spanning quite a broad cultural range there.
Yeah, and I think especially musical reception, I think what ties those two together is, it's like Aphrodite and Ares, being in love. It's kind of, these are two elements of human nature at its extremes of passion and darkness and brutality, and it's focusing on the irrational side of us, which I think music, especially modern music, sort of speaks to. It gets us on that level. It's sort of like I often compare it to we watch a Greek tragedy where it's full of death and breaking of taboos and all of these things that make us feel, as Aristotle might say, pity and fear and these other emotions. It has that, if we want to continue looking at through Aristotle's lens, it has that cathartic effect when we explore these things. It's like watching a horror movie or listening to death metal where you're engaged with these really dark and violent topics. But, as a result of kind of engaging with this, it kind of, you leave the theater or, your record table with a kind of a level head, and they've explored kind of the therapeutic aspects of listening to this kind of music.
I was surprised to hear you mention Orpheus back there. Was it specifically in heavy metal? Because when I think of Orpheus in music, I think of the can-can Orpheus in the Underworld, the 19th century opera. Do 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 do. Yeah, and I don't know. I was surprised. Surprised to hear that crops up. Was it in heavy metal?
It's here and there. It's not one of the most popular topics. One of my favorite songs in heavy metal about Orpheus is by this heavy metal band from the 80s that are still making music today called Cloven Hoof. It's actually kind of a love song. Okay? And so this is one of these instances where, it's sort of a ballad, but it's, a power ballad where sometimes heavy metal does explore that territory. It's not all, tough guy stuff all the time. And it's basically, the narrator of the song is, sort of the Orpheus figure. They are penning some sort of love letter to a beloved, saying things like, I'm going to get you back. I will descend to hell, or I'll go through hell for you, kind of playing with the imagery of the Orpheus myth and then translating it into sort of a modern day sort of love story or sort of situation where there's, a lover who is, trying to maybe get, a wayward beloved back. And so that's another example of, myths are not just, narrated literally in these songs, but they are used as the basis to explore kind of a more general topic. So for instance, there's a rock song that is called Orestes, and they play with the myth of Orestes, and the song itself, it's titled Orestes, but if you read the song, it's possibly set in the modern day, and it's somebody who is dealing with, say, a controlling mother, or, they have these kind of violent feelings against their own mother, because they have that sort of relationship and they're kind of working through those feelings. And then putting the title Orestes on it, gives it very dark kind of interpretation, right?
That really adds another layer to having, being annoyed at your mum, being ready to murder her, as Orestes did to Clytemnestra. I also just wanted to jump in on the Orpheus thing, because for previous listeners, you may remember that in our episode on education, we talked about the story of Hercules killing his music teacher, Linus.
Mm-hmm.
Linus was telling him off for being bad at whatever instrument he was trying to play. And Linus is, in most accounts of the myth, Linus is Orpheus's brother. So that's Hercules' music teacher there. So that's a nice little link to one of the earlier things we talked about.
I think you mentioned something about Aristotle on music and the catharsis of it. Is that something that you could expand on? Because that might be an interesting little thing to kind of link reception to some of the stuff we talk about later.
I know there's a lot of criticism of Aristotle's, theory of, what the audience gets out of, watching a tragedy like the Oedipus, Tyrannus, and whatnot. But nevertheless, I do find it compelling how he talks about that, because a lot of heavy metal, especially extreme metal, such as, death metal and thrash metal, if you read the lyrics, listen to the music, the music is very intense, and the lyrics, talk about things like serial killers and war and death and just dismemberment, sporagmos, if you will, and what draws an audience to this kind of music, and so the immediate analog there is horror movies. Which are a huge influence on, not just death metal, heavy metal itself. That's why Black Sabbath, when they got started in 1969, 1970, they actually called their band after a horror film. And so their music was sort of originally geared as sort of a soundtrack to create that sort of atmosphere that is evoked by, these, 1960s horror films. And then that kind of continued all the way through. And so, what might attract someone to heavy metal music, could be similar to what attracts us to horror films, or even like violent video games like Rome Total War or the Call of Duty whatnot. And there's the whole reaction to and stigmatization of those things, like, oh, if you play violent video games, you'll become a violent person. Or if you listen to, heavy metal, you will become a satanic serial killer, and all of these other things that were stereotypes from the 80s that, have largely been overcome. And as I see it is, well, go watch Euripides' Bacchae, in the theater of Dionysus at the end of the 5th century. And, there's all of this, very kind of, as I see it, kind of death metal kind of stuff, and just dealing with the irrational side of human nature, playing with things like, gender fluidity and all of these kind of quote unquote taboo topics for the time. And so what is the audience getting out of that? Heavy metal kind of has that same similar function. And so combining these various myths from epic and tragedy, especially, but also history, that deal with these kind of violent topics and, sensuality and whatnot.
I do find it really odd that metal has that kind of reputation when all of the metalheads that I know are generally extremely peaceful, chill, lovely people. And it seems to be the only sort of music interest that is lifelong. So people quite often have phases of liking different kinds of music, but a metalhead is a metalhead for life. It's just something quite interesting, like you mentioned about how video games and has this kind of, you'll be violent if you play violent video games, or you'll be violent if you listen to violent music. It's quite an interesting societal assumption. But I suppose if you interact with lyrics about death, and you used a word just now, which I had to look up, about tearing someone apart. Could you remind me what that is?
Oh yeah, that's a sparagmos, and this is actually something where I could go on to another kind of parallel here. So sparagmos is kind of the ritual tearing apart of an animal, sacrificial victim or whatnot, and often it's used in the context of a Dionysian ritual. So a Bacchic ritual, such as is enacted in Euripides' Bacchae, where the women of Thebes are under Dionysus' spell. They run off to Mount Cithaeron and they are engaging in this ritual experience in the worship of Dionysus, where there's music and dance, and there's you take the walk on the wild side and sort of channel your irrational instincts, and then kind of this ritual culminates in literally taking a wild animal and just tearing it limb from limb. And what happens at the end of the Bacchae is Pentheus, who is sort of the antagonist of this group of women and of Dionysus, gets caught by these women, and he is mistaken for a lion by his own mother, who is one of these women under Dionysus' spell, and he is torn apart limb from limb. I find a lot of parallels between the worship of Dionysus in antiquity and, say, heavy metal music, and especially a heavy metal concert. So at a heavy metal concert, it is a communal experience with a bunch of like-minded people. They're all there to essentially, worship the same god of heavy metal, enjoy the music, and whoever's on stage, the guitar heroes and the vocalists and whatnot, that everyone's there to see. And then there is, and it is a time where you're abandoning sort of your everyday walking life rational identity. You take that mask off and you put on a new mask, which is the one that you would put on for that context. So metalheads, they might walk around in band shirts in normal day life, but they tend not to wear the full spikes and leather battle vests and makeup and whatnot. But when you go to a concert, then they're all got up in that, and so that's sort of the Dionysian idea of playing around with identity. Why he's the god of the theater, because you put on a mask and become a different person. And then in that concert, there's loud music, just like in, ancient Greek Dionysian rituals would have that, the very percussion driven music with the aulos and everything. And there's also what I would call ritual movements, where people are headbanging and moshing and kind of moving to the music. And what I've experienced is, by doing that, even just headbanging to a song you really like, that creates this sort of semi-mystical, quasi-religious experience when you're really getting into the music. And of course, there's often consumption of alcohol and other substances at these types of concerts, as at, concerts for plenty of other genres of music, whatnot, which would be, analogous to Dionysus being the god of wine. And so I see Dionysus as one of the quintessential gods of heavy metal.
I guess that links back to the idea of sort of irrationality.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of losing control of the self is quite a key thing, but also in getting really involved in music and and slightly losing your sense of self and just being sort of swept away in a crowd as well. I think that's really interesting. The like communal aspect, it must be so different, even if you're, say, I'm guessing, headbanging to a song that you really like, but you're on your own in your living room. That's probably quite different to being in that communal atmosphere, which is again such an interesting parallel to the sense of ritual that has to happen with the community in the ancient world.
I also think that saying Dionysus as the god of heavy metal is a really brilliant kind of comparison or suggestion. It reminds me of something you'd see in like a series of books like Percy Jackson or something like that, which blends that.
Yes.
Does everyone know those? The like young adult fiction that blends classical myth with the modern day.
One of the kind of foundational scholars in the field of metal studies, which has been around a few decades, is Dina Weinstein, and she in the early 90s kind of did one of the first sort of sociological kind of studies of heavy metal music and its culture. And she sort of came up with this theory that heavy metal music, if you were to use religious terms, it's a form of ditheism. Okay, there's two gods, okay, and Dionysus is one of them. The other god is chaos.
Wow.
So just to wrap up Dionysus before we get to chaos. So Dionysus, he represents liberation from all forms of control, okay? The ability to indulge in the irrational side of your animal nature. So there's this kind of sensual, erotic element, because he's, a male fertility god in many respects. And just the sense of total freedom from any sort of social constraints. And that includes freedom to experiment with various types of identity, of gender and otherwise. And the other side of that coin is chaos. And chaos in both the ancient and modern sense. So the ancient sense of it's the god of negation, it's void. Okay, it is heavy metal, inherently, it's music that is built around what it stands against. Okay, there isn't really a positive philosophy of metal. Okay, it exists in order to be the antagonist, in order to challenge the status quo, and to kind of question any sort of system of truth or authority. And so that's where kind of the modern idea of chaos comes in, where it's the opposite of order. The key word here is heavy metal is often about transgression. Boundaries are meant to be broken. Systems of social conformity and control, political, religious, economic, etc., exist to be the eternal antagonist to heavy metal culture and music, which is why heavy metal often plays with a lot of taboo topics and imagery. So even just for the sake of shock value, in order to upset the establishment, which is why in the 80s it started adopting really, satanic and anti-Christian symbols, because that represented the establishment. It wasn't necessarily, philosophically anti-Christian, but these were symbols that were immediately recognizable as antisocial, against the, what most people believed. And heavy metal originated, in England and in Europe, and then became very popular in America. And so Christianity and value systems and political systems that formed around it, became the bête noire that heavy metal would often react against.
Is it a myth that it originated in Scandinavian countries, metal?
Probably the most common answer you would get for which was the first heavy metal band, that would probably be Black Sabbath, who originated in Birmingham in the late 60s, and they released their first album beginning in 1970. That is often identified as the first one. And it makes sense in that context because Birmingham, at least in the late 60s, early 70s, was a very kind of industrialized working class town, often reacting against modern capitalist, neoliberal, industrialized life, will go hand in hand with sort of a romanticism and nostalgia for a past, whether mythological, legendary, or historical, where these modern conditions were not in place. And this was a place where before Christianity came in, for instance, in ancient Rome or Greece or Norway, for instance. This is the place where my values as, a heavy metal musician, where these irrational aspects of human nature, this sensuality and warrior values were celebrated. I would have fit in much better in these contexts than today, where I feel like I'm a social misfit, because a lot of these things are no longer valued or are challenged.
So is it like almost a romanticization of ancient history, or is it like using ancient history as a way to process the emotions of today?
Those are definitely not mutually exclusive. It's definitely both. This romanticism, is in very many senses a reaction against the status quo, as metal tends to be. That can also be a slippery slope into various political issues, where it depends on what aspects of the past that you are romanticizing here, because, there was a lot of bad things that happened that people did to each other and thought about various groups of people, in those ages that should not be necessarily held as models for today, especially metal bands that sing about ancient history, especially in places like Greece and Italy. It often extends from nationalism and patriotism, but also in some cases it is a coded reaction against globalization, multiculturalism. They're often Eurosceptics. It can get into that, kind of right-wing territory. But, the majority of bands that do, receive classical antiquity, tend to not bring those politics into it. This is just cool stuff to sing about. And, the themes of this stuff resonate with the themes of this music. And we're sort of, again, having this cathartic experience of escaping from our modern reality. And so a lot of this is also just escapism. This is why we read fantasy literature, this is why we like mythology, is because these are worlds where there are different sets of rules, where all of these things happen that don't necessarily happen today.
I have to say, when I was first learning about the ancient world, I thought it was so cool, because it was like a fantasy world, but then it was real, and then you can actually go to these places that are described in this almost fantasy style past.
Definitely, yeah. I think also it's really interesting that the ancient world, Greece and Rome especially, are sometimes received in exactly that way, a way that I think I hope most classicists would really disavow, sort of, going towards like nationalism and holding it up as something to be mirrored, but in a negative way.
Yeah, the irony is that the Roman Empire was hugely multicultural, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Also, I was going to say, I think what we were talking about earlier, but also just sort of there with how people react against music movements. It's interesting that happens very much even within the ancient world. That there's a Plato in his idea of the sort of the perfect republic has really reacts against sort of certain types of music and says that music is important and it should be there, but some music is distracting or bad. So it kind of makes me laugh, because I think we still have that now, don't we? Kind of your grandparents being like, oh, what's this nonsense you listen to now? And there was definitely that in the ancient world. Sort of Aristotle, for example, says that the aulos produces like a passionate rather than an ethical experience, and should be used on those occasions that call for catharsis rather than learning, which I think he's being slightly critical of the aulos there, which is this like a two-pronged flute thing. So yeah, there's even within the cultures that we're talking about, there's like what is this musical thing? What's this new type of music?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up Plato's Republic there. Plato would certainly not like heavy metal in his ideal polis, and the reason I want to just draw on this is that one of the most popular translators of the Republic that a lot of people read in school is Alan Bloom. Alan Bloom is or was a conservative, but Bloom, in addition to translating the Republic and having a lot of ideas about Plato, he also wrote, I think in the late 80s, a book called The Closing of the American Minds, in which it's essentially, a reaction against a lot of the political and cultural movements of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and how he kind of brands it as, oh, this is anti-intellectualism, and one of his scapegoats in that is rock and heavy metal music. He has, he stands a lot against that, and so this is connected to the context of the 80s, in which heavy metal, was often scapegoated as this antisocial, satanic, violent thing that was corrupting the youth. There was congressional hearings in the U.S. Where various heavy metal musicians had to come, and rock musicians had to come and testify that their music, should not be censored, and that this is, we're well-adjusted people. So we can see that even Plato's idea of certain forms of music should be suppressed was used against heavy metal.
By the same guy, is that what you're saying?
By the same guy who translated.
Rather than being being influenced by heavy metal, this guy's been reading too much Plato. He's gone off the rails.
I held off mentioning Sumerian black metal because I didn't know whether Jeremy would have a position on this. But it's this niche little subgenre of black metal where the themes and the lyrics are all very Mesopotamian.
And something that I'm very excited to see in recent years is not just heavy metal and black metal and other genres that are receiving ancient Mesopotamian mythology and history. The Enuma Elish is quite popular in a lot of heavy metal. In fact, there are bands called Marduk and Tiamat,
okay.
For instance.
Enuma Elish being the Babylonian creation myth.
That's right.
For context, yeah.
Yep. But there's also bands who are from that area who are also drawing from those traditions. So, for instance, probably one of the most well-known ones is Melechesh, who are I think they originated in Israel, and I think they're in Europe, somewhere in Europe now. But they were a very popular Mesopotamian tradition history band. But there's also bands, more recent bands. So, for instance, I just came across a band the other day, which is a heavy metal band called Tabernacle, and they are from the United Arab Emirates. And they just came out with a demo recently where they have songs about Akkadian history. So they have a song called Sargon the Conqueror. So that's something you can sink your teeth into there.
Yeah, definitely.
They play sort of epic traditional heavy metal. So it's a little more accessible.
It's interesting to hear. Yeah, I had looked into Melechesh as well, and it's interesting to hear that there are some of these bands who come from the Middle East, because I sometimes wonder, is it a bit orientalizing if you have Western acts kind of co-opting these themes and aesthetics, especially because it's often associated with the other and being kind of destructive of Western forms and, as you say, anti-Christian and occult and stuff like that. And it's interesting that the object of that ends up being Eastern civilizations that these people may have no historic connection to. But yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, the Orientalism is definitely there. So, for instance, metal bands that sing about ancient Egypt, they often recycle a lot of those tropes. So, for instance, I've studied a lot of songs about Cleopatra, and, definitely seen as that Orientalized other, and, very much Egyptian and not Greek and all of that. And then a lot of other, songs about Hatshepsut and Nefertiti, play with that as well. And then probably the most famous band to sing about Egypt specifically is the American band from South Carolina called Nile. And so they're very well researched they know their stuff, but they, for aesthetic purposes at least, they still, play with a lot of orientalizing stuff, being American and kind of appropriating this. But just one last thing on kind of the Middle Eastern reception here. There's another band from Iran, and I forget what they're called, but they have a song about Xerxes. And often when you have heavy metal that mentions Xerxes, it's usually he's the antagonist of, the Spartans, and therefore he represents everything metal stands against. But this Iranian band uses Xerxes as a very positive figure, as someone who they want to essentially rise from the grave and restore Iran to its ancient glory, not in the sense of, being a conquering empire necessarily, but to overthrow, the Islamic theocracy, because they see Xerxes as, an enlightened ruler who, governed a multicultural and very inclusive kind of empire, which it essentially, more or less was. So you can see how, in a specific cultural context, heavy metal as this sort of forever antagonist to the establishment can draw from the ancient past in order to seek alternatives to the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to defend Xerxes against the 300 effect for quite a long time. I think we said in a previous episode that Xerxes should better be remembered as a builder than a tyrant or warrior. But yeah, that's really fascinating. And I guess you've mentioned a couple of times metal in the West being anti-Christian, so there's no reason why metal that comes from Islamic countries shouldn't have anti-Islamic tropes in it.
Flo, can you make a joke about what's the creation myth called again? The Babylonian one?
Enuma Elish.
Okay, have we got a Billie Eilish joke we can make here? Do you guys
Enuma
know?
Eilish.
I was just the whole time you guys were talking about that, I was like,
all right, a half-formed joke is as good as any.
Sorry, I really like Enuma Eilish, and I don't want to steal Meg's joke, but you could certainly say something like, because Jeremy mentioned Tiamat, who's the enemy primordial force in Enuma Elish, so you could say that she's the bad guy for Enuma Elish.
Might as well come in with a cheesy pun.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Against the Law, and thank you to Dr. Jeremy Swist for being our guest today. This episode comes with a Spotify playlist of all the tracks we talked about, so follow us on Twitter @AgainstLaw to get the link. Next time, we'll carry on the conversation about music, but we'll be talking about what music was like in the ancient world. If you enjoyed this episode and want more myth-busting content, then follow us on Twitter and TikTok and support us on Patreon. Just search for Against the Law Podcast.